We are delighted to have a second edition of a conversation we started last year with Os Guinness and David Wells, and they're delighted, I think, to be back to have the conversation with us again. Historians have written much about the Renaissance of the evangelical movement at mid-century. We know the names. Carl Henry's infamous book, The Uneasy Conscience of Fundamentalism, was a coming out party in some ways for this new evangelical movement as it engaged culture. Billy Graham, so long associated with us, held the Boston Evangelistic Crusade in 1949 at the Boston Garden and packed it out for weeks. It was a remarkable renaissance. Our own Harold John Ockengay, a significant presence here, our first president of the merged Gordon-Conwell, was a voice all across America. Historians have yet to write the story of evangelicalism at the end of the 20th century, but when they do, these two individuals here will play significant roles. If the Renaissance at mid-century was about evangelicals coming into the mainstream, David and Oz have warned us about the dangers of being in the midstream and the mainstream of American culture. They are lifelong friends, not really, but they did meet at seminary in London back in 1962, together at London Bible College, and then later friendships at L'Abri as well. And part of the wonderful time we had with them last year was listening not only to the conversation they were having with us, but with each other. They have been astute observers of culture as friends who shared a common heritage in this great evangelical faith, but sometimes with a different tone. And it's sharing that conversation that I want to invite you in on this afternoon. You know them both well. Our dear colleague, David Wells, longtime Andrew Much Professor of Theology here at Gordon-Conwell, now Senior Research Professor of Theology, wrote much in the early days on the character of the revolutions taking place in the religions so dear, evangelicals as well as Roman Catholics in the 1960s. Oz wrote that wonderfully poignant piece at the end of the 1960s, early in the 1970s, on the character of that decade, the dust of death. And they both come in their later writings to continue to ask, what are the times we live in? Oz's most recent book, The Global Public Square, asks the question, how can religion flourish in the midst of our great diversities? And David's work, The Courage to be Protestant, a strange question, is it not, in some ways, in the Protestant United States of America. But they both helped us ask the questions, how do we live in our time? First, we must understand our times. And so today we've asked them to address the question I think they're going to address. You're never sure when you get the two of them together. How to speak into an empty but partisan culture. And so David first with his prepared remarks, and then Oz.
Thank you so much, and thank you for those very kind remarks, which I don't think I could possibly live up to, although Oz certainly does. And thank you for this wonderful opportunity afforded me, personally, to be with my old friend again. As Rick said, we have been friends beginning as seminary students in the same classes and over the last 50-odd years. Now, Oz and I are engaged here in a little thought experiment. As Rick said, Professor Lintz, said, I'm going to try to set this up, talking about our partisan and empty culture, and then he's going to follow by talking about speaking into this culture. And what's experimental about it is the fact that he does not know what I'm going to say. And actually, I didn't know what I was going to say until about a day ago. So he's going to have to do a little bit of improvising, I imagine, but I know that he is more than equal to that. So the easiest part of this for me is to talk about our partisan culture. 1 in every 4 Americans say that they would like their state to withdraw from the Union. And all of those could not be living in Texas. And we all know that the approval numbers for Congress are at an historic low, 11%, something like that. These are little facts that tell us that we are living in an unhappy political time. But our discord, as we all know, reaches across a broad swath of social issues as well. And our politicians, many of them, have become adept at exploiting those social divisions for their own gain. Perhaps it was ever so that politicians were always like this. But I do think the level of divisiveness today, the extent to which it shapes and, most importantly, limits what we talk about in public, I think is unusual. It does indeed remind me of the 60s through which some of us lived, at least at this point of divisiveness. And there are 2 wonderful books that have been written on this by Dr. Guinness and Dr. Lintz, though I should warn you immediately, if you plan on buying Dr. Lintz's book, it suffers from this defect, that if you're content to settle for a used copy on Amazon, it will nevertheless still cost you $128.96. I borrowed his personal copy when I wanted to read it. But now, with respect to our own time, I have a little thesis that I want to try to work out with you, and you'll have to tell me if you think I am correct. I brought the wrong glasses, so I can't even see that clock up there. So if I prattle on too long, you will tell me, won't you? What I want to suggest is that, socially speaking, we today are in a perfect storm. On the one hand, our culture is getting hollowed out and it has no center. And on the other hand, our diversity is increasing. And the combination of these 2 things makes it very difficult for us to handle and resolve some of our differences. So to explore this thesis, I want very quickly and firstly to go back to the founding of our nation, because it has an important connection here. Then secondly, I want to look at this matter of a lost center. And then finally, I want to talk about some of the newer forms of diversity. So, beginning with the American founding first. In 1776, nobody could have seen how these 2 ideas which were at its center, freedom and equality, nobody could have seen how those were going to play out. Nobody could have seen that the nation was going to survive, for this really was a novel experiment. A little bit later, earlier in the next century, a number of quite distinguished Europeans came to America, to see with their own eyes what was happening. I suppose the best known of these was Tocqueville and his book in which he recorded his reflections, Democracy in America. Most Europeans typically would think that equality and freedom were contradictory. The more free people are to pursue their own self-interest, the more unequal people become in a society, because we all have different abilities, different dispositions, different drives. And so some people end up, if they are free, some people end up very wealthy and others end up very poor. So it appeared to them that freedom and equality were contradictory. Americans then, and I think most today, think about these in a different way. Freedom means the ability to pursue any opportunity, to explore any idea, and to express any ideas publicly that people want. And equality was understood not as the equality of ends or outcomes, but rather that everybody, no matter who they are, when they are beckoned by opportunity, can follow that opportunity. So nobody gets a head start in life. Nobody should begin with unfair advantage simply because of who they are or where they were born. So Americans thought about freedom and equality in a different way. However, and this now is the important point, these two guiding principles of freedom and equality were never thought to stand alone in this social experiment that has become America. Our founders who wrote the documents had an acute sense of human corruption. That capacity that human beings have to become disruptive and harmful. They were very cautious about putting too much power in anybody's hands for that reason. John Adams, when he was vice president, said that the government did not have the capacity to restrain human passions. That government, in this experiment of freedom and equality, government would not work if there was not the restraining and guiding influence of both religion and morality. A little bit after Adams said this, Tocqueville observed the very same thing. He said that government, it is clear that the opinions, prejudices, interests, and even passions of the people can find no lasting obstacles preventing them from being manifest in the daily conduct of society. It was the same point. Government itself cannot restrain these passions. Now, it's clear that this is right. Think about the law, and here I'm thinking about the law as criminal law. The law condemns murder, but it cannot reach into our internal lives and change the hatred from which the murder comes. The criminal law condemns and punishes stealing, but it cannot reach into people's internal lives and encourage respect for the property of others so that they don't steal. And if the law lacks the power to control human nature, it is also the case that the law, this criminal law, lacks the power to command many of the behaviors that we would like to see in our society. The law cannot command respect for others. It cannot require of us that we be kind and considerate. It cannot command that we be generous to those in need. In all of these ways, our internal life has to be disciplined and channeled by religion and morality. The state cannot command what is ethically right. It can only condemn what is legally wrong. So, our founders saw the need for a center in our life and in our national life to provide what the law and what government could not do. But they did not establish any religion to fill this need. They could not, and of course the First Amendment prohibits it. So what they gave us is a very interesting solution. Because on the one hand, they certainly refused to create a sacred public square. That is to say, a theocracy. That wasn't even an option. But nor yet did they create for us a naked public square, such as the secularists want, in which they insist that religious understanding have no part at all in our public discussions. What the founders gave us is something in between those two options. Which therefore brings me to this whole question of a center. And now I want to step back and, as it were, use a zoom lens. I want to think more widely, but it's always the same issue. This issue of a center from which arise norms and meaning, I think has become the defining issue of our time. And it has emerged as an issue in proportion to the degree to which a country becomes modernized. It's an interesting thing. So what I'm going to do is to give you a series of glimpses across time, about a century, a series of glimpses as to what it means for a center to begin to disintegrate and disappear. Let me begin in shortly after the First World War with the devastation that had wrought. And W.B. Yeats's famous poem, The Second Coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are filled with passionate intensity. A little while after this, about 30 years later, Emil Brunner, the Swiss theologian, and this is now after the Second World War and after the devastation of that war, he is pondering this remarkable new civilization that's sort of emerging from the ashes. Shiny, sleek cities, absolutely brilliant technology, the industrial wheels beginning to turn, people's lives beginning to be bettered. And he marveled at what was happening. But he said that unfortunately, all this is being built over a vacuum. He was thinking in particular about the processes of secularization that had advanced quite far in Europe at that time. Everything that encourages people to think that there is no connection between life and any kind of transcendent. Building this self-enclosed world, a world only with windows and no skylights. a world where people are unrestrained. What's going to happen when unrestrained people get their hands on some of these weapons of such enormous destructive power as we have? That was his question. About 20 years after this, Daniel Boorstin, the American historian, looking back on this time, the first beginning of the 20th century up through the middle years, he says it was a time of triumphal and accelerating science, but, he says, it produced a literature without precedent. It was a literature of bewilderment. He was talking about so many authors who saw themselves as being alone in the cosmos, alienated, disconnected from any commanding central principles, adrift on a sea of meaninglessness. He was thinking of people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Camus, and in England, Beckett and Pinter. A few years after this, in 1984, but still very much part of this unprecedented literature, Milan Kundera wrote his book, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which also became a movie. It's a rather haunting tale of the relationships of four people. And through these relationships, he ponders this paradox between what's light and what's weighty in life. What makes life light? What makes it meaningless and inconsequential? Well, it is its passing, transient nature. Life's events, its passions, its torments, its laughter, everything that happens within a blank universe, where everything, as he puts it, is in the sunset of dissolution. All passes, all is lost, nothing is retrievable. At the end of the day, what we said, what we did, it's all gone. There's nothing there. And if there's nothing there, then how can anybody make a judgment as to whether it was true or false, meaningful or meaningless? There's nothing there to judge. And therefore, we are without responsibility. We are not responsible for anything, and we are not responsible to anyone. This absolute absence of a burden causes man to be lighter than air and become only half real. Now, there is, of course, an alternative to what he was seeing and saying. And the alternative is that life, in fact, is consequential because there is a center before whom we are responsible. But if this is so, he says, then, I'm quoting him, we are nailed to eternity as Jesus Christ was to the cross. That would make life weighty, but it would also make it unbearable. Now, this literature was pondering life in a deserted universe. It's a literature that's sharp and clear and pungent. But in time, some of that sharpness and pungency began to dissipate. And this philosophy became more of a mood. It is the postmodern mood. In Lyotard's postmodern condition, we have what has become a basic definition of it. As a mood, it is incredulity towards meta-narratives. That is, people have come to think that it is impossible for there to be any universal truth. Impossible that there is any meaning besides that which is personal and private. There might be little fragments that we call truths, but there is no such thing as truth with a capital T. So, if there are no principles that apply to everyone, if there is no common core of meaning, it becomes very difficult to see how we can restrain or adjudicate between competing versions of reality. Adjudicate over what is true and the competing and clashing private interests and the competing and clashing group interests. This postmodern mood has rearranged the inner lives of people. So we might say that it is the postmodern mood is now producing a postmodern profile, more evident among those who are younger than older. But therapists have written about this. They are seeing a pattern. And it goes something like this. Many of these younger people recount how they grew up in good homes. They went off to college, but they are baffled by the sense of emptiness within. Their self-esteem is high, but their self is hollow and empty. They grew up being told they could be anything that they wanted to be, but they don't know what they want to be, even after they've been to college. They want to be idealistic, but they don't have any ideals. They are unhappy, but there's no specific cause for their unhappiness. They are connected to more people through the social media than any previous generation has been. And yet they are lonely. They desperately want to be accepted, but they carry within themselves all the time a sense of alienation. And then last year, Jonathan Sacks, who at that time was the chief rabbi in England, pondered all of this, and he said that if the foundations of Western society crumble, can we expect what rests upon it to stand? And he went back to Nietzsche and Nietzsche's terrifying vision when he saw what would happen when religion was dislodged from people's minds and morality would go with it. And then we're left with nothing but the will to power. Then there are no unjust laws or laws that are exploitative, because people will simply be acting on the law of nature. And the law of nature is one in which the strong always dominate and oftentimes eliminate the weak. This is the moment when barbarians will arise. Those who want to impose their will and their truth on the whole world, and people that combine, as he put it, hatred of the other, the pursuit of power, and the contempt for human rights. So a culture today throughout the West, certainly here in the US, where there are no commanding principles recognized by most, no norms, no universal meaning, but rather every view can be pursued and prosecuted if there is an advantage to it. And my time is rapidly fleeing. Let me just quickly summarize. Diversity. There are many different kinds of diversity. America has a long and good history, for example, of opening doors to immigrants. But there are newer forms of diversity. For example, from our exposure to the internet and from the fact of specialization. On the internet, we encounter a multiplicity of worldviews, of ideas, of opinions, of half-baked opinions, of inanity. It strikes us like driving through a hailstorm. And the effect of it all is to relativize all viewpoints, even those that are true. I would like to have illustrated this by comparing the Encyclopedia Britannica and Wikipedia. But the assumption beneath Wikipedia, which is a free encyclopedia which anybody can edit, the assumption beneath it is the democratization of all knowledge. That everybody's viewpoint is valid. And they hoped that by putting all viewpoints together, somehow they would get knowledge which was untainted and unbiased. But this democratization of knowledge is really what drives blogging, or at least I should say, drives people to want to blog, and the stuff on Facebook. And in the absence of norms and a center, one viewpoint is as good as another. Finally, on this matter of diversity, the whole question of specialization. This has become the hallmark of our time. We have to specialize to become both more proficient and more efficient. And so what happens is that all of us hone particular skills or particular knowledge to fit into niches. But what happens is that once we're in there, we're likely to be contained within a miniature world of understanding. And communication across these miniature worlds becomes difficult. We even have that, dare I say it, here at Gordon-Conwell, where you have profs who are specialists in their fields. The fields all have their own literatures, their own hierarchy as to who is important and whose name one should cite, their own technical language and their own ways of talking. And it's not easy for us even to talk to one another at anything more than a surface level. Now, we here have a center. We have a common faith. We have the Bible. Remove that and then multiply by 1,000,000 the effects of specialization, and you begin to see what's happened in our society. So, a perfect storm, a lost center, increasing diversity. This is our world. It is here that we must learn how to think Christianly, to fashion out how life actually looks from the center which is there, which is our triune God and his holy love. But how specifically are we going to move from there, Dr. Guinness, to speaking into this empty and partisan culture?
Thank you, David. Tremendous pleasure to be back. I remember the last time I was here was very stimulating, so I've looked forward to this. Dr. Lynch said that Dr. Wells would give his prepared remarks and then I would speak. The implication was probably right that mine would not be prepared. But to be thoroughly honest, I'd forgotten till yesterday the topic we were given. And the idea that I could respond to that, in fact, the idea that anyone could respond to that apart from the Lord, I'm not sure I would even begin. We are great friends, and we met 1962 or 3. I hope, beyond what I'll say today, you will see behind our friendship and our lives and our work, we've been very different. David's been in seminaries. I've been in Washington think tanks, much more secular. He's been much more specialized in theology, and I'm frankly not a scholar, but a generalist. But behind our journeys, certainly intellectually, if you're thinking, you can see a number of important parts that all of you will have to master in your turn. We met in 1962, and one of the links then was John Stott. And that friendship with John Stott represented what in Britain then was very strong. Magnificent biblical teaching. So at London University, we had teachers like John Stott, Martin Lloyd-Jones, Jim Packer, Michael Green. We were rich in that. But to be fair to them, and John and others realized that later, they understood almost nothing about the culture. And here we were with the counterculture exploding. They didn't understand it at all. So theology was like a deep, rich block, unrelated to the world. And for both of us, in different ways, in different times, the second thing was through Francis Schaeffer. And in those days, he was one of the very few, a handful, who could connect all the dots in culture, but particularly his strength was, technically, the history of ideas. Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, etc., how the ideas had washed down in the rain, as he put it, and you needed to understand the history of ideas to really know all the things going on in the culture. So to the rich, strong theology was added a much deeper cultural sense through the history of ideas, and I hope you all have that too. But I certainly realized, after my time at L'Abri, that it was mostly ideas. And a huge amount of our culture isn't ideas. Technology, television, all sorts of current things like cell phones. You can't explain that through Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard, and so on. And it was then that I first came across, in the early 70s, Peter Berger and the discipline of the sociology of knowledge. How you analyze people's life worlds, the settings in which they live, and how these things, which are not primarily intellectual, actually shape even their thinking. So what they think is true and appears to be knowledge and self-evident is shaped by these things around in their social worlds. And so for both of us, in different ways, David's applied that very much to theology, you can see we've gone, not leaving theology behind, of course, that's the root bedrock convictions, but adding the history of ideas, adding the sociology of knowledge and cultural analysis, to hopefully having a broader Christian worldview that can really help tackle the sort of issues we're facing in our world today. And I hope by the end of your time here at Gordon-Conwell, you'll all have at least those three. The first one, of course, the primary and the foundational. Now, I want to go on rather responding to what David said. I'm not going to do that. I'd like in many ways to underscore it in a different direction. Before World War I, and this year, the 100th anniversary, you realize how shattering World War I was to Western civilization. It's never been the same. Karl Kraus, who was a satirist and a comedian in Austria, in Vienna, he remarked that Vienna was the research laboratory for the destruction of the world. In other words, there were movements of ideas in Vienna, philosophically, the Vienna Circle, psychologically, Freud, artistically, many other things, including trends that went through like suicide epidemics. He saw that what was happening in Vienna was a microcosm of what would destroy Western civilization. Now, sadly, 100 years later, you've got to say that the United States is a research lab for the destruction of free societies. The ideas and trends flowing through this culture are, as David's analyzed, making the great experiment unsustainable. And that's what you've got to minister in such a world. Now, as I live in Washington and try and analyze some of this, I always ask myself, how much is the result of human ideas and human forces, and how much is the result of the impact of what David and I would call, and many others too, modernity? In other words, not specifically human ideas like modernism, a set of ideas, but modernity, this whole constellation of the world in which we're living. I don't know what you think is the most radical set of ideas today going around that are destructive. People would have your candidates. For me, I tackled a lot of secularists. In Oxford, The place I live is about 75 yards from Richard Dawkins' house. I've known many of the world's great atheists like Bertrand Russell and A.J. Ayer. And you can see things like the separationists who are trying to clean religion out of public life. There are a lot of things like that. But for me, the most radical set of ideas that I come across today are in what's called the social constructivists. And you can see them very clearly in terms of the gender revolution. And you have again and again three little maxims which put together become incredibly radical. First, there are no givens. We believe in a created order. Some things would be biologically or, in the long run, sociologically impossible, but for the social constructive, no. There are no givens at all. We are the creators. Secondly, and flowing out of that, there are no rules. Obviously, if God is dead, everything's relativistic. There are no rules except the ones we make with our own will to power, as David was saying. No givens, no rules, and the third thing, no limits. No limits to what humans can create by themselves. And if you see some of this stuff and engage with some of these people, I think we're in a highly modern form of a kind of Tower of Babel Prometheanism. We are our own creators, and maybe we'll have to go to the post-human future and introduce our robots and all this sort of stuff as they look towards the long future. But for me, that is the most radical, deep alternative to our Christian faith. And we have to give not only arguments against it for its folly and its danger, but create a magnificent, positive, constructive vision based on the Scriptures, a Jewish and Christian view of human well-being, flourishing, the current term, but really is over against this radical humanism of the social constructivists. So think of those three maxims and hold them in the back of your mind. No givens, no rules, and no limits. That, to me, is the toughest thing we're facing humanly as we go forward. But as David is suggesting, if you look at modernity, you have another set of problems. We're living in this world, he called it the loss of center. Well, in the last 5 years, I've had 3 political leaders, 2 in this country and 1 in England. I was there in England in early July. And I got a call from the House of Lords by one of the Lords, and he said, could we have lunch together? And he gave an almost carbon copy of 2 descriptions of our culture I'd heard from American leaders. He gave an incredible description of the crisis we're facing, and then said at the end, what can a good man do? When I first heard this in Washington, I was speaking on Capitol Hill, and at the end of the talk, a congressman put up his hand and he said, if there's a flood, a small boy can be a hero by putting his finger in the dike. You all know the Dutch story, the little boy who prevented the flood. He said, I'm looking out in America, there isn't a flood. This was 5 years ago, before the events in Washington State earlier. He said, I'm looking out in America, and what I see is not a flood, but a mudslide. How can anyone do anything? The other man I talked to called it a meltdown. David called it the loss of center. W.B. Yeats' term. Now, what's behind that? There are ideas, and David described it. But I, too, have wrestled with that for a number of years, because there's something beyond combating bad ideas. If you go back even, say, to the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx says something very intriguing there, which others have pondered on. He said, all that is sacred is profane. That's pretty obvious. Then he said, all that is solid is melting into air. David's loss of center. All that is solid is melting into air. Nietzsche said, when God dies, cultures become weightless. Out of that, Milan Kundera. What does that? One of my favorite social scientists to read is actually a Jewish atheist who's terrible when he deals with religion. But in terms of this melting down, he's extremely good, Zygmunt Bauman. And his metaphor is we're living in a liquid world where the solid realities have melted and evaporated. Now, the technical term for it is a crisis of cultural authority, a crisis of legitimacy. In other words, ideas like freedom and many other ideas once had compelling power. They had substance, David's center, and now they're melting and then evaporating. So you're just left with words, 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 and nothing much means anything very much. Well, what's created that? Yes, certain radical ideas. But as best as I can get to the bottom of it, I don't think I've quite got there yet. You may think this sounds a little bizarre. I call it the 3R forces, and the combination of the three creates this meltdown, this mudslide, this, but another alternative people are using, a black hole. So that when solid ideas come into the orbit of this 3R forces, they just melt and evaporate and become utterly little more than words and emptiness. The 3R's are this, and David covered one of them. The first is the radical relativizing of all certainties and claims. Take Derrida, quoted already. Everything is, quote, undecidable. Well, if everything's undecidable, you literally haven't got very much in your hand at the end of the day. The second, this is much more at the heart of modernity, the range of choices. We have an incredible range of choices today, from things trivial like cereals up to things incredibly important like worldviews and so on. But the net effect, they're all just another choice, a preference, a whim. And why does it matter when I can choose another one tomorrow? And I should always be open because there may be many more good ones tomorrow. So we should always have our mouths open. But then you add the third one, the rapidity of change. Nothing's lasting very long today. So everything is ephemeral. Now you put those together, the radical relativizing of truth and certainties, the range of options, meaning everything's just a preference and a whim, and then the rapidity of change, reducing everything to the ephemeral. And it's as if we're living in a world where all the great truths. Now, David said rightly here at Gordon-Conwell, you have a center, our Lord, the Scriptures. But let's be honest. Much of the preaching around the country sounds as unreal as anything else does today. In other words, you're leaving here maybe with solid convictions theologically, but as you go out and speak and preach into that world is like a black hole, taking these solid things and they're just melting. And preaching isn't having the impact on our culture that it should have or it used to have. Now, I'm not going to suggest an alternative response. It would be almost too cheap in a few minutes. But I would say that if, of those quotations I gave you, Nietzsche is right, when God dies, everything becomes weightless. The answer in Scripture is when God is there, why is there a weightiness? You know, the root meaning of the word glory is weight. Weight. Reality. Everything in the universe, including us, is a derived reality because we're created from the Lord, by the Lord. And the longer we go from Him, our reality goes. And you can see the Hebrew word Ichabod. The glory has gone. Not just the reputation, the renown. No, the internal reality and the weightiness has gone. And Israel, armies were easily defeated even when they took the ark. And overall was written Ichabod. The glory is gone. And you can see that could be written over much of the Western church today. Ichabod. The glory is gone. But what's the biblical answer to that? A return to the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So, don't leave your theology at the level of abstraction or abstract doctrine, but make sure when you leave here, you move out with a faith that is theologically deep and rich. but a knowledge of it through the Spirit of God, which means it is so real because it's directly in touch with God himself, and you are bringing that glory, that weightiness back out into our culture again. So ponder the world you're going into and ask yourself as you go out whether you are the living response by God's grace to the black hole we're facing today. Now, of course, some of you are from Asia or Africa, and we all know the wonderful things happening there, but I always add a sting in the tail. I was born in China, and I thank God for the explosion of the house churches and many other things in China. When my parents left China, maybe 750,000 Christians. Today, who knows how many? 80? 100 million? We don't know exactly. But I go back and I meet them high in the party, followers of Jesus and so on. So I'm inspired by what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa and in China and many other countries. But there's a sting in the tail. Most of the global south is largely pre-modern. What's done in the church in the West is its capitulation to this advanced modern world, which leaves two simple but very, very profound questions. Can any religion, of course we would say, can the Christian faith, can any religion, for us, the Christian faith, prevail with integrity and effectiveness over the challenges of the advanced modern world? That's one question. The second question, and this one raised by people like Emil Brunner, whom you quoted, Christopher Dawson, others after World War II, they raised the question, looking at the poor shape of the church in Europe, and increasingly here, a generation later, can the church in the West be, as they put it, warmed, revived, awakened, a third time? And Christopher Dawson answered his own question. Emil Brunner was actually candid enough to say, I'm not sure it can. Not sure it can. Christopher Dawson answered it much more confidently, historian. He said, every Christian should say yes. But we mustn't say yes too quickly or too lightly, because on the answer to that question this time probably defends the future of humanity. Do you get that? If you look at the global challenges we're moving into and the convergence of these challenges, so that your generation is called the crunch generation. In other words, the convergence is creating crunch problems which will have to be answered in your lifetime if human society is to go forward calmly. Huge questions. Atheism doesn't have the answer. Buddhism and Hinduism are retreat religions in terms of engagement with modernity. It's not a cliche or a truism to say only in the gospel do you have the deepest answers for the great challenges of humanity in the future. But the church as we are in America today, certainly the church as we are in Europe, I'm European, at the moment is unable to answer those because of what David called the loss of center, what I've called this meltdown, mudslide, black hole, or whatever it is. So, by God's grace, can we see such a revival and reformation, such a recovery of integrity and effectiveness, that you in your preaching as you go out, your ministering at large, can really move out so the gospel has a reality which is more than an answer to the challenges of modernity. That's the question. But over to you. We get discussion, Rick, or what?
We've got time for a couple of questions, but I get the first one. Two-part. Tease out just a little bit more the weightlessness, this metastasization of choice that makes anything relative, alongside of the really partisan, passionate partisanship. Why do people actually care about some things so almost in an angry way in our time?
Almost?
Almost. And secondly, preaching the gospel can also sound pretty angry in a time. How do we preach the truth without being partisan? Two parts.
Well, what we have created, and there are many people who have written about this, is a radical individualism. At the time of America's founding, the early years, people were individualists in the sense that they accepted responsibility for their own lives, made a living for themselves, cared for their families, that kind of thing. It was an individualism then in the context of community. The individualism today that we have is radical because it is disconnected from everything. So, to the contemporary individualist, the only consideration is the value of the self and the needs of the self. And those are pursued sometimes with an intensity and passion that is angry, and it does become divisive. The problem is, as Oz was saying, in the presence of this black hole and this mudslide, for many people, there is nothing left except the self. And that finds expression in politics and all kinds of other things, too.
Novelists are often an antenna for this, and one of the extraordinary books on this is Michel Houellebecq, a French novelist, called Elementary Particles. And it's the story of a Frenchman who, from the 60s, pursues every movement that's going through France, from the hippie communes right down, and the man is disillusioned at the end, and the book ends with masturbation. Keith Richards says, making love to your best friend, totally isolated at the end. And you have an incredible novelistic description of what David said. Let me pick up the other half. If you look through history, there's always a danger when culture's under stress take to the gospel in forms of conservatism that become ugly because they really depart from the gospel. You can see it classically in our lifetime, say in apartheid South Africa, or closer to home for me, Northern Ireland in Ulster. My family's from the south. And you can see that tendency here, people actually latching on to the gospel to bolster up a decaying culture in this country. And it's always deadly because we stray from the scriptures and we lack a prophetic critique of ourselves. And I always quote, if you look at the rise of Christendom, it was the first truly an attempt to create a consistent Christian culture. And they were so sure it was Christian, they lost any prophetic critique. So the first historian of Christendom said something like this. He said, I set about writing the story of two kingdoms, two cities, obviously referring to St. Augustine, the city of God, city of man. But he said, after a while, I realized I'm writing the story only of one city, Christendom. But when you begin to think that what you're doing is it, you don't have any prophetic critique. And Christendom's produced the world's greatest evils that Christians have ever perpetrated because of that lack of critique. So today there are many, many people using the gospel to bolster a culture under stress. And we've got to be careful it's being exploited in ways that deny the gospel.
A couple of questions, brief ones.
Yes. First of all, thank you for speaking to us. Over the past month, the National Football League has been dragged into the public square by a wave of domestic abuse cases. The country's reacted to these incidents with shock and outrage, but any movement for meaningful change or discipline has thus far been rendered impotent. Do you think or believe that in some way disgust can cut through the relativism that our culture has cultivated?
What was the last sentence?
Do you think that disgust has a way to cut through the relativism that we've cultivated?
Do you want a European to comment on your great American sport?
Look, it's a business. I'm quite certain that is the main consideration, whether there will be profit or loss. That's how it's calculated.
I live in Washington. A lot of controversy of our team's name. And when we went there, the coach was a wonderful Christian brother, Joe Gibbs. But there is no question that American football is very close to violence on the field. And when you add that to a kind of celebrity culture, so the super athlete from sort of 15 onwards, no one says no to them. Mm-hmm. And you can see you breed people who are beyond sort of normal moral restraints. Now, Joe Gibbs always chose people of character, and we had a very high number of Christians on the Redskins, and we never had any of these sort of problems, usually not on the field and certainly not at home. But as it's gone generally with the secularization and so on, for the reasons David mentioned, commerce, but also the celebrity culture, you can see it's reached a point something will have to be done. The NFL game has become corrupt at its heart. There's no question. But I've always been a fan of the other type of football.
Here, in the middle.
You commented on the fact that the global South is still in a modern era while the Western church is postmodern.
I didn't say postmodern.
Well, in the context of world missions, and Gordon is extremely passionate about missions, what do you think would be the natural outcome of a Western ideology on the global South, and how should we, what cautions would you give us as we try and encourage people to get involved in missions?
Well, missions, my experience, Dave is an African. My experience of Africa is mostly Egypt and South Africa, not much in the middle. But from friends I know, like the Archbishop of Uganda and so on, they would say, one, we need discipleship. Evangelism has vastly outstripped discipleship. But then I would add, you need discipleship that can discern and resist modernity. So, for example, in China, in the house church movements, mainly in the rural areas, the courage to withstand the viciousness of Mao Zedong's persecution was incredible. But those same people, as they go, say, Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, whatever, it's actually harder to resist the blandishments of modernity in Shanghai than it was to resist the persecution of Mao Zedong in the country. And we need to say in the West, don't do what we did. We've got to be humble. We did it badly. But then help them with good teaching for discipleship, but an understanding in modernity what it is they're going to face. So at the Lausanne Congress, I met an African evangelist, a white South African. He said he could easily go to the Congo with two huge loudspeakers and Land Rovers and so on, and maybe 10,000 would come to Christ in an evening. Hundreds of thousands over the course of the month. But that shows you how evangelism vastly outstripped discipleship. So they need, for example, the Chinese churches have no Gordon-Conwell. So their vulnerability without teaching, without seminary training for pastors, their vulnerability to shallowness or heresy, is extraordinary.
I do think it's important for us to understand that what we are talking about here is not the exporting of a Western ideology. I think that was perhaps an issue in an earlier missionary generation, taking European civilization to other parts. But what we're talking about, and what we actually both talked about at Lausanne in Cape Town, was that the Global South is only now just beginning to be modernized, meaning the accumulation of people in large cities, at least here in the West, this is modernization, for the purposes of production and consumption, all laced together by information and technology and the processes of capitalism. Now, where you get that mix, as we have it here in spades, and Europe too, where you get that mix, it creates a public environment. It creates a way that people think. It produces habits in us. Oz talked about this constant choosing between products, for example. We are experts in choosing. Because we're doing it all the time, And when Christian faith is rolled into that, or major ideas, they tend to be treated as we would when we go and choose between two brands of a toothpaste. This is coming to the global south. And the one thing that we both said when we spoke at Lausanne was, please learn from us, because we have not done well in facing up to this, thinking about it, understanding it, adjusting accordingly, and as it were, positioning our churches, our pastors, positioning our churches through teaching and understanding and action to be a counter to this, to be an alternative to it, to be places where the weightiness of God's glory is evident. We haven't done well in this, and if the third world could understand from our mistakes, it would be a great thing.
Mm-hmm. Could I pick up one more point? And I hope this doesn't sound semantic. You said about postmodern. Now, you remember where I began with the history of ideas and the sociology of knowledge. In terms of the history of ideas, it is legitimate, you were right, you can move from modernism, a set of ideas, to postmodernism, another set of ideas. That's legitimate. But when we're talking about cultural analysis, the sociology of knowledge, and modernity, it's inconceivable to be post-modernity and postmodern in that sense. Short of a nuclear disaster, wiping out all our civilization as we know it, post-modernity is inconceivable. We've got to wrestle with it. That, to me, is the greater challenge than even postmodernism. Postmodernism can be answered. And someone could say, well, I used to be postmodern, now I'm Christian. Gone. Postmodernity is inconceivable. You will never get beyond it, short of the Lord's return. You mean through the media, or how does...
Let me just repeat the question a little bit for those maybe in the back. We're asking about the media and appropriate or inappropriate ways for Christians to speak into the media and with the media.
Well, there's two problems, I think. One is our living with this media. And the question is, how can we each have a diet of information that is responsible and healthy? So take a trivial example. With the internet, many people will turn on their emails before they read the scriptures. You know, that's very trivial. But you can see that the primacy of scripture is undermined by this flood of, and that's only the beginning of it. So we've each got to be very careful. Say, I read the New York Times every day. And I know it's a highly liberal paper. You have to know the assumptions of the source of information you have, and particularly today, we have to have not too much of it, because many people are under such a Niagara of information, they just come out benumbed about everything. So we've got to help each other choose a healthy diet of information that's responsible and discerning. Now, in terms of our using it, I used to be with the BBC a bit, you've got to begin with, say, what is each form of the media good at and not good at? So take a very obvious example. Radio is word-based. Television is image-based. And you read someone like Malcolm Muggeridge, who knew the problems of expressing faith. He often used to say it. The only person he'd ever saw make a good case for the faith on television was Mother Teresa. And it was partly the holiness of her character which somehow shone through. So you've got to know the nature of the media. Obviously, something like blogs, the quick descent to dark types of discourse, to put it mildly, or just the shortness of it. Or you take something like direct mail. Studies have been done of a lot of the Christian right direct mail. Which words were undermined in red or green? Well, direct mail has a certain style and character to it. The words undermined were 80% fear words or hate words. In other words, you've got to understand the media you're using in order to surmount its handicaps to get the gospel across. Very difficult today. takes a huge amount of thought.
I would only add to that there are a lot of studies that have come out showing that people who are online a lot find that their ability to concentrate evaporates. As a matter of fact, there was one study done that the attention span of the average person, that they can actually focus on something and stay with it, is only 3 minutes. And we are constantly interrupting ourselves, because this is what that media does. You go from one thing to another to another. So it breeds impatience. We want quick results now, just as you get them when you Google something. But the reality is that God himself cannot be downloaded. And all of the great things in life that are worth having in your life take time. If you think about it, they're not instantaneous. The great things take time. And learning to know God and learning to walk with God takes time, and it takes self-discipline. Discipline away from that media.
Another way of putting it is the difference between the internet and the incarnation, and the craziness of our modern forms are driving us back to the simple, profoundly human. Our Lord, to reach us, became one of us, and there's nothing deeper than the face-to-face, the person-to-person, and that has a lot to say about churches and all the multiple venues and all that sort of things today. And I think a lot of the craziness of the extremes is making us realize the preciousness of the simple and the profound and the human.
Our last question.
Yes, I think my question sort of ties into everything. So my question is this: is the hollowingness or the emptiness of society really a good thing because it's first step to salvation? So let me give a little historical context. Albert Schweitzer wrote sort of massive volumes. I don't think he ever completed it, but it was on the history of civilization. And what he said, he was observing sort of this idea that we at one time in modernity figured we had it right. And I think for cultural references, it's sort of like Kipling's poem, Take Up the White Man's Burden, that he presented to Congress. And it was this idea that, the American empire, now that the sort of British Empire seems to be crumbling, can take up and sort of solve the world's problems. But that was the problem in itself, was this sort of modern concept. And I think if postmodernity does exist, it's a period of reflection to say, as Schweitzer concluded, that we cannot go back to the modernity concept, but we must go to pre-modernity where God was centered in our thinking.
Well, again, I'd insist we can't go post-modernity in that wider sense. We can go postmodernist, but not post-modernity, and we need to sort of get some of those things clear. But two huge shifts. One, we've gone from a world of what's called singular modernity. In other words, the future of the world was the way the Western world went. We've gone from that to what's called multiple modernities. There are different ways of being modern in different parts of the world. So there's an Asian modernity. Within Asia, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Singaporean. In other words, there are multiple modernities. So we in the West have got to get over the old idea that globalization equals westernization, equals Americanization, equals Coca-Colonization, as they put it. That's gone. America is irrelevant to huge parts of the world, sadly. The other thing is the Enlightenment. We're beyond the Enlightenment. Anyone who thinks that the human progress unhindered is going forward, that's collapsed totally. And postmodernism is an example of that collapse. But there's one part of it left, technology. And when I mentioned the social constructivism, their hope is solely in technology, which includes science, biogenetic engineering, and all this. Through technology now, not through a broad Kantian style of enlightenment, but through technology, they can do it and produce this human future.
I won't add
The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, the Proverbs tell us. Proverbs also remind us, as Professor Wells and Guinness have told us, wisdom is hard to come by. It's especially hard in a day like ours. But the Proverbs also tell us that when you see it, you'll know it, and we have seen it here today. And so with a great appreciation to David and to Oz, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.